The day I discovered that my own brother had been systematically destroying everything I had ever worked for was the day I finally understood that the people who share your blood can sometimes be the ones most eager to spill it. I was standing in the ruins of what should have been my future, holding a stack of documents that proved a betrayal so deep and so calculated that even now, years later, my hands shake when I think about it. Marcus, my older brother by 5 years. The person who used to carry me on his shoulders at the county fair, who taught me to ride a bike, who promised at our father's grave that he would always protect me, had been working behind my back for years to take everything our family had built and leave me with absolutely nothing. My name is Sophie Bennett, and this is the story of how my brother became my worst enemy and how I made certain that every single lie he told came back to destroy him. Growing up in Bristol, England, Marcus and I were inseparable in the way that only siblings can be. He was the golden child, the firstborn son who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, especially our mother's. I came along 5 years later, something of a surprise, and from the beginning, it felt like the family dynamics had already been established before I arrived. Marcus was charming, confident, and effortlessly popular. He had this ability to walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. People gravitated toward him like moths to a flame, and I spent most of my childhood watching from the sidelines, simultaneously awed by his charisma and invisible in his shadow. Our father, Richard Bennett, built a property development company from nothing. He started with a single rundown flat that he renovated himself, working nights and weekends while holding down a job at a construction firm. By the time I was born, Bennett Properties had grown into a respectable business with a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across the Southwest. Dad was a quiet man, principled and hardworking, who believed that everything worth having was worth earning through honest effort. He never gave us handouts. Instead, he made us work at the company during school holidays, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. Marcus hated it. He was always disappearing to meet friends or coming up with excuses to avoid the mundane tasks Dad assigned him. I, on the other hand, loved every minute of it. I loved walking through construction sites with my father, listening to him explain the intricacies of building codes and tenant negotiations. I loved the smell of fresh paint and new carpets in a renovated property. Most of all, I loved the way my father's eyes would light up when he talked about what he had created, the pride in his voice when he showed me a building and said, "This was just rubble when I bought it, Sophie. Remember that. Anything broken can be rebuilt if you're willing to put in the work." I took those words to heart. I studied business at university while Marcus drifted through a communications degree, changing his mind about his future every other week. After graduating, I came straight back to work at Bennett Properties, starting at the bottom despite being the owner's daughter. I did the filing, answered the phones, dealt with difficult tenants, and slowly worked my way up. Marcus, meanwhile, bounced between jobs, always blaming his failures on bad luck or jealous colleagues. He would show up at family dinners with grand plans for businesses he wanted to start, asking Dad for investment money, and our mother would always encourage our father to support him. "He just needs a chance," Mom would say. "He's brilliant, Richard. He just hasn't found his calling yet." Dad always gave in eventually, not because he believed in Marcus's schemes, but because he loved his son and couldn't bear to see him struggle. Over the years, tens of thousands of pounds disappeared into Marcus's failed ventures: a nightclub that closed after 6 months, a tech startup that never launched, a so-called consulting firm that existed only on paper. Each failure was met with excuses, and each time Marcus emerged unscathed, ready to pitch the next big idea while I continued working 12-hour days to actually grow the family business. By the time I was 25, I had become indispensable to Bennett Properties. I handled the accounts, managed tenant relations, oversaw renovations, and developed strategies for expansion. Dad started relying on me more and more as his health began to decline. He had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years earlier, and although he tried to hide it, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he would pause to catch his breath after climbing stairs. I begged him to retire, to let me take over the day-to-day operations, but he was stubborn. "Not yet," he would say. "There are still things I need to teach you." What he didn't tell me, what I wouldn't discover until it was almost too late, was that he was preparing for his death. Not just emotionally, but legally and financially. He had been quietly updating his will, restructuring the company ownership and putting safeguards in place to protect the business and, he hoped, his children. He wanted to be fair to both of us, even though Marcus had contributed virtually nothing to the company, while I had given it everything. Dad died on a cold November morning 18 months ago. He collapsed in his office at home, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. I remember my mother's screams echoing through the house, the way Marcus arrived 2 hours later with red eyes that I now know were fake, the suffocating grief that made it impossible to breathe for weeks afterward. I had lost not just my father, but my mentor, my partner, my best friend. The man who believed in me when no one else did. The man who saw me when everyone else was too busy looking at Marcus. The reading of the will was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral, enough time for the initial shock to subside, but not enough for anyone to truly begin healing. We gathered in the office of Dad's solicitor, a serious man named Jeffrey Mills, who had handled my father's legal affairs for over 20 years. Mum sat between Marcus and me, clutching tissues, her face pale and drawn. I held her hand, trying to comfort her, while Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw tight with an expression I couldn't read. What Jeffrey read that day would set in motion everything that followed. The will was clear and, I thought at the time, incredibly fair. Dad had left the family home to our mother, along with a substantial cash inheritance to ensure she would never have to worry about money. The business, however, was divided differently than anyone expected. I was to receive 60% of Bennett Properties, along with the position of managing director. Marcus would receive 40%, with a seat on the board but no operational control. Dad had included a letter with the will explaining his reasoning. He loved us both equally, he wrote, but he had to think about what was best for the company, for the employees who depended on it, for the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Sophie had earned her position through years of dedication and hard work. He hoped Marcus would support his sister and finally find his place within the family business. I cried when Jeffrey finished reading, not because of what I had inherited, but because of what it meant. Dad had seen me. He had recognized my contributions. He had trusted me with his life's work. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. Marcus did not cry. He sat in silence for a long moment, his face completely blank, and then he stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Mum called after him, but he didn't stop. I assumed he was upset, that he needed time to process. I told myself that once the grief subsided, we would talk, we would work things out, we would find a way to honor Dad's memory together. I was so incredibly naive. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 weeks after the will reading. I had thrown myself into running the company, working even longer hours than before, determined to prove that Dad's faith in me was justified. I was reviewing the quarterly accounts when I noticed something strange. There were several large payments totaling nearly £50,000 made to a company I didn't recognize. The invoices were vague, mentioning consulting services without any detail about what those services actually entailed. I asked our accountant, a woman named Barbara who had worked for my father for 15 years, about the payments. She seemed nervous, hesitant in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Marcus authorized those," she said finally. "He said you approved them." I had approved nothing of the sort. I had never even heard of this consulting company. But when I tried to reach Marcus to ask him about it, he didn't return my calls. Days passed, then a week. When I finally cornered him at a family dinner at Mum's house, he was dismissive and evasive. "It's just a vendor I've been working with," he said, waving his hand as if the £50,000 were pocket change. "They're helping me develop some ideas for the company, expansion opportunities. You're always saying you want to grow the business, Sophie. I'm trying to help." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. There was a condescension there, a barely concealed contempt that I had never noticed before, or maybe I had noticed it and simply refused to acknowledge it. I wanted to believe the best in my brother. I needed to believe that underneath whatever resentment he felt about the will, he still loved me, still wanted what was best for our family. I let it go. That was my first mistake. Over the following months, more irregularities emerged. Equipment purchases that never materialized, service contracts with companies that seemed to exist only on paper, unauthorized withdrawals from company accounts that Marcus always had explanations for, explanations that grew more elaborate and less convincing each time. When I raised my concerns with Barbara, she confessed that she had been uncomfortable with Marcus's activities for a while but was afraid to speak up. He threatened my job, she admitted, her voice shaking. He said if I told you anything, he would make sure I was fired. He said you would believe him over me because he's family. That was when I knew I had to dig deeper. I started staying late at the office, going through years of financial records, looking for patterns. What I found was devastating. Marcus had been stealing from the company for years, long before Dad died. Small amounts at first, easily hidden among legitimate expenses, but growing bolder over time. He had set up multiple shell companies, all of them funneling money from Bennett properties into accounts that I couldn't trace. By my rough calculations, he had embezzled nearly £300,000 over the past 5 years, and he had been doing it right under our father's nose. I don't know how to describe what I felt in that moment. Betrayal seems too small a word. This was my brother, my blood. The person who had carried me on his shoulders and taught me to ride a bike and promised at our father's grave that he would always protect me. He had been stealing from our family, from our father, from the company Dad had spent his entire life building. He had watched Dad work himself to exhaustion, watched his health fail, and all the while, he had been picking his pockets like a common thief. I called my best friend Priya that night. We had known each other since secondary school, and she had gone on to become a forensic accountant specializing in fraud investigation. I told her everything, barely able to get the words out through my tears. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally finished, she said something that would change everything. Sophie, you need to document all of this before you confront him. If what you're telling me is true, he's not going to stop. He's going to cover his tracks, destroy evidence, and probably try to turn your mother against you. You need to be prepared for war. I didn't want war. I wanted my brother back. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding, some universe in which Marcus hadn't spent years systematically betraying everyone who loved him. But I knew Priya was right. Whatever came next, I needed to be ready. Over the following weeks, I gathered evidence with a methodical precision that surprised even myself. I made copies of every suspicious transaction, photographed invoices, traced the shell companies back to their registration documents. Priya helped me follow the money, and what we found was even worse than I had initially thought. Marcus hadn't just been embezzling from the company. He had been forging my father's signature on documents, redirecting funds that were supposed to go into maintenance accounts, and using company money to fund his increasingly lavish lifestyle. He had bought a new car, a luxury SUV that he claimed was a gift from a friend. He had taken expensive holidays to Dubai and the Caribbean, always with some excuse about business opportunities he was exploring. He had been living like a king on money stolen from our family's legacy. But the worst discovery came when I found a series of emails that Marcus had carelessly left in a shared company inbox. They were correspondence between him and a property developer from London, discussing a potential sale of several key properties in the Bennett portfolio. Properties that Marcus had no authority to sell, properties that would gut the company and leave it barely functional. He was trying to sell off our father's life's work piece by piece, presumably pocketing the proceeds for himself. I confronted him at his flat on a rainy Thursday evening. I went alone, despite James's protests that I should have backup. James was my partner, a financial analyst I had been dating for 3 years. He was steady and kind, the opposite of the chaos that seemed to follow Marcus everywhere. He had never trusted my brother, and now I understood why. Marcus opened the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sophie, what a surprise! Come in, come in. Can I get you a drink?" I walked past him into the living room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The flat was immaculate, filled with expensive furniture and artwork that I now knew had been purchased with stolen money. I turned to face him, and I let the folder I was carrying fall open on his coffee table. Copies of bank statements, forged signatures, email exchanges, registration documents for shell companies, all of it laid out in damning detail. "Explain this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Marcus's expression didn't change. He picked up one of the documents, glanced at it, and set it back down with an almost casual indifference. "Where did you get these?" "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're going to get." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. There was no guilt there, no remorse, only contempt. "You were always so desperate to prove yourself, Sophie. following Dad around like a little puppy, working yourself to death for scraps of his approval. And what did it get you? A company that's barely profitable and a lifetime of being overlooked. Dad trusted me with this company. Dad was a fool, Marcus spat. He spent his whole life building something he never got to enjoy, working until it killed him. And for what? So you could inherit his prison? No, thank you. I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to be that pathetic. I was going to take what I deserved. By stealing from your own family? By securing my future. He stepped closer, and I forced myself not to back away. Do you really think you can do anything with those documents, Sophie? Go to the police? Take me to court? I'll tell everyone you're unstable, that you're trying to push me out of the company because you can't handle sharing. Mum will believe me. She always does. And who do you think people will side with? The charming firstborn son or the quiet little sister no one ever noticed? I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. He had underestimated me, just like he always had, just like everyone always had. I'm not going to push you out of the company, Marcus, I said quietly. I'm going to destroy you, and you're going to watch it happen, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. I left before he could respond. As I walked to my car, my hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. Priya had been right. This was war. And I was going to win. Going to. The first thing I did was hire a solicitor, not just any solicitor, but one who specialized in corporate fraud and family disputes. Her name was Catherine Drake, a formidable woman in her 50s with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. When I laid out my evidence, she nodded slowly, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. This is comprehensive, she said, but I have to be honest with you, Sophie. Family fraud cases are complicated. The courts are generally reluctant to intervene in what they see as family disputes. And if your brother is as manipulative as you say, he's going to try to turn this into a he said, she said situation. We need more than documents. We need witnesses. We need patterns of behavior. And most importantly, we need to catch him in the act. I spent the next 3 months doing exactly that. I set traps, creating fake business opportunities that would require Marcus to access company funds. I installed discrete monitoring software on the company's financial systems, tracking every transaction in real time. I documented every lie he told, every excuse he made, every discrepancy between what he claimed and what actually happened. Meanwhile, I had to maintain the facade of normalcy. I smiled at family dinners. I nodded along when Marcus talked about his plans for the company. I watched my mother dote on him, completely oblivious to what her golden child was doing behind closed doors. It was exhausting and heartbreaking in equal measure. There were nights when I came home to James and just collapsed, unable to speak, unable to do anything but cry. James held me through all of it. "You're doing the right thing," he would say. "I know it doesn't feel like it, but you are. Your father would be proud of you." I wasn't sure about that. Dad had loved Marcus despite everything. Would he really want me to expose his son, to drag the family name through the mud, to potentially send his firstborn to prison? I grappled with that question constantly, but every time I wavered, I thought about what Marcus had said that night in his flat. Dad was a fool. I decided I wasn't going to be that pathetic. I was going to take what I deserved. No, Dad wasn't a fool. He was a good man who had been betrayed by his own son, and he deserved justice even if he was no longer here to see it. The breakthrough came 4 months into my investigation. Marcus had been courting a major investor, a property development firm from Manchester that was looking to expand into the Southwest. He had been talking up his role in Bennett Properties, presenting himself as the driving force behind the company's success. What he didn't know was that I had reached out to this firm separately, presenting myself as the managing director and expressing interest in exploring a partnership. The confusion that ensued was illuminating. The Manchester firm had been receiving 2 completely different narratives about Bennett Properties, one from me, accurate and professional, and one from Marcus, filled with inflated projections and outright lies. When they asked for clarification, I invited them for a visit to our offices, suggesting a date when I knew Marcus would be out of town. What happened during that meeting confirmed my worst suspicions. Marcus had been promising them a stake in properties that he had no authority to sell. He had been using the company's reputation to secure personal favors and kickbacks. And most damningly, he had been funneling their initial good faith deposits, money intended for due diligence and preliminary assessments, directly into his personal accounts. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was theft from external investors. This was the kind of thing that could destroy the company entirely if it became public. I had two choices. I could try to cover up Marcus's crimes, pay back the investors quietly, and hope that no one ever found out. Or I could do what I knew was right, even though it would tear my family apart. I chose the truth. Catherine helped me prepare a formal complaint to the Serious Fraud Office. The evidence we submitted was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, email correspondence, testimony from Barbara and other employees who had witnessed Marcus's behavior. We also reached out to the Manchester firm and several other investors Marcus had defrauded, building a coalition of victims who were willing to cooperate with the investigation. When the SFO agents arrived at Marcus's flat to execute a search warrant, I was at home, watching my phone and waiting for news. James sat beside me, holding my hand, neither of us able to speak. Part of me still couldn't believe it had come to this. Part of me still hoped there had been some mistake, that the brother I remembered from childhood, the one who carried me on his shoulders and taught me to ride a bike, was still in there somewhere, buried under all the lies. But when Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or satisfaction, just a profound, bone-deep sadness and relief. Finally, after months of living with this secret, the truth was coming out. The fallout was immediate and devastating. The news spread through our community like wildfire. Bennett Properties, the respectable family business that Richard Bennett had built from nothing, was now at the center of a fraud scandal. Our phone rang constantly. Journalists, concerned clients, angry investors. I had to issue public statements, reassure our tenants, convince our partners that the company was still viable despite what one rogue member of the family had done. My mother's reaction was the hardest to bear. When I called to tell her about Marcus's arrest, before she heard about it from someone else, she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she started crying, not the quiet tears of grief, but the racking sobs of someone whose entire world has just collapsed. "How could you do this?" she finally managed. "He's your brother, Sophie, your blood. How could you do this to your own family?" "Mom, he's been stealing from us for years. He forged Dad's signature. He betrayed everything Dad built." "I don't believe it. I don't believe any of it. You've always been jealous of him, ever since you were children. You've always wanted what he had, and now you're trying to destroy him because you can't stand that he's finally doing well." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall. I wanted to drive to her house and force her to look at the evidence, to see what her precious golden child had actually been doing. But I knew it wouldn't matter. She had spent her whole life making excuses for Marcus. She wasn't going to stop now. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, my voice hollow. "But I did what I had to do. I hope one day you'll understand that." She hung up without saying goodbye. We didn't speak for 3 months. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. In the meantime, Marcus was released on bail, and he wasted no time mounting a public relations campaign to paint himself as the victim. He gave interviews to local newspapers, claiming that I had fabricated evidence to push him out of the company. He accused me of manipulating our dying father, of taking advantage of his illness to secure a larger inheritance. He portrayed himself as the loving son who had tried to help the family business, only to be betrayed by his jealous younger sister. Some people believed him. That was the most painful part. People who had known me for years, who had watched me work myself to exhaustion for Bennett Properties, suddenly looked at me differently. There were whispers when I walked into rooms. Old friends stopped returning my calls. The isolation was profound and crushing. But I had allies too. James stood by me through everything, never wavering in his support. Priya worked tirelessly to strengthen the prosecution's case, uncovering even more evidence of Marcus's fraud. Catherine became not just my solicitor, but my advocate, coaching me through depositions and preparing me for what would come in court. And slowly, as the truth began to emerge through official channels, public opinion started to shift. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I was called as a witness for the prosecution, and sitting in that courtroom, facing my brother across the room, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He looked different, thinner, his charm worn away by months of legal battles. But there was still defiance in his eyes, still that contempt I had seen the night I confronted him at his flat. The prosecutor walked me through the evidence piece by piece. The shell companies, the forged signatures, the diverted funds, the lies. I answered every question as calmly as I could, even when the defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter, jealous sibling who would do anything to get ahead. I kept my composure, kept my voice steady, kept reminding myself that the truth was on my side. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, I watched him try to work his old magic. The charming smile, the self-deprecating humor, the earnest pleas for understanding. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and the jury wasn't fooled. One by one, his lies unraveled under cross-examination. He contradicted himself, lost his temper, revealed the contempt he had so carefully hidden for so many years. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. I was sitting in the gallery when the foreman read the decision. My mother was there too, for the first time since the trial began. She had finally agreed to meet with me and look at the evidence, and though she still couldn't fully accept what Marcus had done, she had at least stopped blaming me. When the verdict was announced, she reached over and took my hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Marcus was sentenced to 6 years in prison, along with a complete forfeiture of his shares in Bennett Properties as partial restitution for his crimes. The judge called his actions a profound betrayal of family trust, and noted that his lack of remorse was deeply troubling. As he was led away in handcuffs, Marcus turned to look at me one last time. I expected hatred in his eyes, anger, but what I saw was something closer to resignation, maybe even regret, though I'll never know for sure. In the months that followed, I worked to rebuild what Marcus had damaged. We repaid the defrauded investors, restored our relationships with partners and clients, and slowly regained our reputation in the community. It wasn't easy. The scandal had taken its toll, and there were days when I wondered if the company would survive. But it did. We did. My mother and I have begun to repair our relationship, though it will never be what it was before. She visits Marcus in prison every month, which I understand even if I can't bring myself to join her. He's still her son. She still loves him. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I still love him too. But I will never trust him again. That part of our relationship is gone forever. James proposed to me last spring on the anniversary of my father's death. We were standing at Dad's grave, and he got down on one knee and said, "Your father would want you to be happy, Sophie. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you are." I said yes through tears, knowing that for the first time in a long time, they were tears of joy. Priya was my maid of honor at the wedding. Catherine came as a guest. Even Barbara was there, the accountant who had been too afraid to speak up for so long. They had all played a part in my journey, and I wanted them there to celebrate the next chapter. As I stood at the altar, looking at the man I loved, surrounded by the people who had stood by me through the worst years of my life, I thought about what my father told me all those years ago. Anything broken can be rebuilt if you're willing to put in the work. He was right. About the buildings, about the business, about me. Marcus tried to destroy me. He tried to take everything our father built and burn it to the ground. But he underestimated me. He underestimated the quiet little sister no one ever noticed. And in the end, that was his greatest mistake. I don't think about revenge anymore. What I did wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about truth. It was about honoring my father's legacy and protecting everything he sacrificed to build. Marcus made his choices, and he faced the consequences. That's how it should be. These days, Bennett Properties is thriving. We've expanded into new markets, hired new employees, renovated dozens of properties that bring joy and stability to the families who live in them. When I walk through a construction site now, I can almost hear my father's voice, explaining how the work is done, reminding me that anything worth having is worth earning through honest effort. I earned this. Not because I was favored or lucky, but because I showed up every day and did the work. Because I refused to give up, even when the people closest to me tried to tear me down. Because I believed in something bigger than myself. My brother became my enemy. But I became something stronger. I became the person my father always knew I could be. And that is the only victory that ever truly mattered.